The walls of Carthage were 37 feet thick and 43 feet tall. Rome spent 3 years trying to break through them and failed every single attempt. What finally brought Carthage down had nothing to do with rams or siege towers. Rome simply cut off the grain ships. Within months, 700,000 people were eating leather and boiling their sandals. The city that had withstood every military assault in its history collapsed not to superior steel, but to an empty granary. That pattern, a great fortified power brought low not by what entered through its gates, but by what stopped arriving at its docks, repeats itself across 3,000 years of imperial history. And the mechanism behind it is brutally simple arithmetic. Start with the human body, because that is where every siege begins. A soldier on active duty needs roughly 3,000 calories a day to function at combat effectiveness. Drop that to 1,500 sustained over 6 weeks, and cognitive function deteriorates measurably. Drop it to 800, which is what happened inside Jerusalem during the Roman siege of 70 CE, and men start hallucinating. The historian Josephus records citizens killing each other over scraps of dung-stained grain. A city of approximately 600,000 people crammed inside walls that were genuinely impregnable by the military technology of the time required something in the neighborhood of 1.8 billion calories per month to stay functional. Rome did not need to outfight those walls. It needed to interrupt that number. And the logistics of interrupting it were far simpler than the logistics of supplying it. This is the first asymmetry that kills empires. Defense scales with population. A bigger city needs more food, more water, more fuel, but a besieging force can be fed from the countryside it already controls. The aggressor's supply chain gets shorter every mile it advances. The defender's gets longer and more fragile every mile the enemy closes in. When the Assyrians besieged Lachish in 701 BCE, they were not trying to outwall the Judahites. They were cutting the 6 main roads that connected Lachish to its regional grain depots. The walls stood. The grain routes did not. What makes this counterintuitive is that we tend to narrate sieges as tests of military engineering. The catapult versus the battlement, the tunnel versus the foundation. But the actual logistical record tells a different story. In the siege of Syracuse in 213 BCE, Roman engineers spent months constructing elaborate siege machinery to breach what Archimedes had fortified. Every machine failed. What eventually broke Syracuse was a small Roman force that found an unguarded section of wall during a festival. Yes, but that festival happened because the garrison was already severely depleted by a typhoid outbreak, driven largely by contaminated water supplies after the city's external aqueduct was sabotaged. The machines get the drama. The water sabotage gets the footnote. The footnote won the war. Now consider the scale at which this operated inside empires, not just cities. The Western Roman Empire, at its height, was moving an estimated 400,000 tons of grain per year from North Africa and Egypt to feed Rome and supply its legions. This required roughly 3,200 cargo voyages annually, coordinated through a supply bureaucracy that employed tens of thousands of people, none of whom carried a sword. When the Vandals seized Carthage in 439 CE and took control of the North African grain supply, the blow was not military. Rome did not lose a battle. It lost its caloric base. Within 40 years, the Western Empire ceased to exist, not because barbarian armies were undefeatable, but because the ox carts stopped. This is the deeper mechanism worth sitting with. An empire is not a military structure. It is an energy distribution network wearing military armor. The armor is visible. The network is not. And every single time in the historical record that an empire was dismantled quickly, the actual point of failure was the network, not the armor. The Mongols did not simply out-cavalry the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate. They destroyed the Qanat irrigation systems in Persia, the underground aqueducts that had sustained agricultural production for 6 centuries. The agricultural output of the Iranian plateau dropped by an estimated 75% within a generation. You cannot armor an irrigation channel. You cannot station a legion inside every grain ship. The meta lesson hidden inside every one of these collapses is this: complexity is a vulnerability dressed as a strength. The same interconnected supply network that lets an empire project power across a continent creates a fragile web of dependencies that a precise, patient adversary can unravel without ever meeting you in open battle. Rome looked undefeatable on a battlefield. It was acutely fragile at a choke point. Every empire that came after it repeated the same mistake of confusing military supremacy with logistical resilience, because one of those things is visible from outside the walls, and one of them is not. When scholars look at the collapse of major civilizations, from the Bronze Age system's failure around 1200 BCE, when entire networks of palace economies disintegrated within decades, to the late imperial Chinese dynasties that fell during famines their military could not prevent, the through line is consistent. No empire in the historical record was ever made invulnerable by its weapons. Several were made invulnerable by their granaries, and every single one that fell first in its supply chain before it fell on its walls. The swords are in the museums. The grain ledgers are in the dust. But if you want to understand which one actually decided who survived, you have to read the ledgers. The sources for this are in the description, and the oldest ones are the most revealing.